August, 480 BC, the Pass of Thermopylae. Amid a narrow strip of land trapped between towering mountains and the sea, one of the most famous battles of the ancient world had finally come to an end. For days, a coalition of Greek city-states had stood against the advancing might of the Persian Empire. But when the final defensive line was breached and King Leonidas and his remaining warriors fell beneath a storm of arrows, the story did not conclude with the kind of heroic scene so often portrayed in modern films. There was no triumphant sunset, no swelling orchestral score, and no victorious celebration. For those who survived, the ordeal was only beginning. Modern cinema has given us a deeply misleading picture of war. Historical blockbusters almost always end at the most dramatic moment. The hero falls, the enemy retreats, and the screen fades to black. The audience leaves believing that the story is over. In reality, for the people who lived through the conflicts of the ancient world, the aftermath was often more brutal and haunting than the battle itself. For both Greeks and Persians at Thermopylae, the silence that followed the fighting revealed a grim reality. The battlefield was littered with the dead and dying. Wounded men cried out for help. Missing comrades had to be located. Families would soon begin searching for news of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return home. Under the harsh summer sun of Greece, every passing hour made the situation more desperate. Many people today imagine that the most terrifying part of warfare was the clash of shields, spears, and swords in the heat of combat. Yet for countless ancient soldiers, the true test began after the fighting ended. Recovering the wounded, identifying the fallen, performing burial rites, and confronting the psychological scars left by the carnage were tasks that could haunt survivors long after the battle itself had passed. Today, we will step beyond the simplified narratives of textbooks and the spectacle of Hollywood to examine the reality of what followed the Battle of Thermopylae. What happened on the battlefield after the last arrows were fired? How were the wounded treated with the limited medical knowledge of the age? And what was the human cost of witnessing one of history's most legendary last stands? The silence after Thermopylae was not peace. It was the worst sound the survivors had ever heard. Just minutes earlier, this narrow strip of rock between the mountains and the sea had been a screaming furnace of bronze and blood. 20,000 Persians pressing forward, a few thousand Greeks holding the line. Now there was only the wind off the Malian Gulf, and underneath it something quieter, moaning. Hundreds of voices, none loud enough to carry, all too weak to be ignored. Xerxes did not let his men rest. The great king had just spent 2 entire days and roughly 20,000 soldiers trying to break through a gap held by a force a fraction of that size. He was furious, humiliated, and now the road south finally lay open. There was no time for a victory feast. Within the hour, Persian officers were already moving through the wreckage of their own ranks, not celebrating, counting. Xerxes wanted numbers before he wanted songs. How many Medes were dead? How many of the elite immortals, his personal guard, supposedly invincible, now humiliatingly thinned out by a few hundred Spartans and Thespians with longer spears and better discipline? Meanwhile, on the Greek side, almost no one was left to write anything. By the time the final hour of fighting began, the remaining defenders, Leonidas already dead, his body the subject of a vicious tug-of-war on the slope, had retreated to a small hillock near the pass. They did not surrender. They fought with broken spears, then swords. Then, according to Herodotus, with bare hands and teeth when the swords broke too. They were finally overwhelmed by arrows from a distance, because even the Persians had learned, painfully, not to get close to Spartans anymore. Herodotus tells us the Persians had already tried the direct approach twice in the preceding days, and twice the line had held against everything Xerxes threw at it, including, on the second day, his own personal bodyguard. By the time this final hillock fell, no Persian commander wanted another close engagement with men who fought like they had nothing left to lose, because by that point, they genuinely did not. So when the silence fell, there was effectively no one left on that hillock to feel relief. What remained was a field strewn with thousands of Persian dead, a smaller cluster of Greek dead on the final hill, and an army of conquerors who now had to decide what to do with all of it, starting immediately. Because in the August heat, immediately was not a suggestion. It was biology handing down a deadline. Picture the exhaustion. These men had fought for the better part of 3 days under a punishing sun, watched friends die at arm's length, and now, instead of rest, they were being organized into work units. There would be no fires lit for celebration tonight, no songs, just officers barking the next order, and the sound of sandals dragging through dust that no longer felt like victory. Part 2. Sorting the living from the dead. The first job was the cruelest one, and it had nothing to do with honor. Across the pass, surviving Persian officers organized search parties to move through their own dead and wounded, and more cautiously, through what remained of the Greek side. It was triage performed with a spear instead of a stethoscope. A wounded man who could still walk or be carried might be pulled aside for treatment. A man with his guts opened by a Greek spear, with no realistic path back to health, received something far more direct, a short practice thrust, delivered without ceremony. No one on that field would have called it cruelty. They called it mercy, and meant it sincerely. There was no hope of recovery once the bowel had been opened to the air, only days of agony, ending the same way regardless. This sorting was also dangerous, in a way that's easy to underestimate. Some of the fallen Greeks were not actually dead. A man can take a serious wound and still have strength left for one final act of violence, especially a man who has spent 3 days being told that dying well is the entire point of his existence. So Persian search parties moved carefully, often in pairs, one man checking a body while another stood ready with a spear, because a dead Spartan suddenly very much alive with a dagger was a lesson some unlucky soldiers had already learned the hard way. The same discipline that made the 300 so devastating in life made them dangerous even in death. Several ancient accounts describe Persian soldiers approaching the final Spartan position with visible hesitation, even after the fighting had clearly stopped. Fear doesn't always end when the swinging stops. Sometimes it just changes shape. Once the wounded had been separated, attention turned to a problem of staggering scale. 9,000 bodies, by most ancient estimates, lay across a battlefield no wider than a narrow country road. The August sun does not pause for grief, and decomposition in that heat begins within hours. Whatever sentiment any soldier might have felt had to compete with a louder, more practical question. What do you do with 9,000 corpses before they poison the only water source for miles? We'll get to that horror shortly, but first, there was gold to deal with, and the Persians treated a battlefield's spoils with a discipline that would have surprised anyone who pictured Xerxes' army as an undisciplined horde. The spoils of a narrow victory. Here is something Hollywood has trained us to misunderstand. In the ancient world, stripping the dead was not disrespect. It was simply how soldiers got paid. A Persian infantryman did not enlist for patriotic salary alone. Part of his expected compensation came from exactly this moment. Walking the field and claiming whatever valuables the enemy had been foolish enough to die wearing. Bronze cuirasses, shields, daggers, the occasional gold bracelet. No one called this dishonorable. It was simply payday, delivered by the dead instead of a treasury clerk. But Thermopylae was strange compared to most battles, because of exactly who the defenders were. The Spartans were famous for owning almost nothing of individual value, no elaborate jewelry, no gilded armor, like wealthier Greek hoplites sometimes wore. A Spartan's wealth lived in his reputation and his land back home. The famous lambda on a Spartan shield wasn't decoration in the way other Greek city-states decorated theirs. Athenian shields might carry owls or gorgons, personal or city emblems meant to be recognized and remembered. The lambda was almost defiantly plain, a single letter announcing where its bearer came from and nothing more, because a Spartan needed no other introduction. So Persian soldiers expecting a windfall off the legendary 300 found something almost insultingly modest: plain bronze, ruined red cloaks, simple round shields hacked half to pieces. The real value, ironically, wasn't in the metal, it was in the story. Xerxes understood this, and what he did next reveals far more about psychological warfare than any chapter on Persian strategy ever quite captures. According to Herodotus, Xerxes personally walked the field to view the Greek dead, wanting to see, with his own eyes, what had cost him so much. What he allegedly did to the body of Leonidas afterward, beheading it, then mounting the head on a stake, was not standard Persian practice. Persian kings typically showed considerable respect toward defeated commanders, even honoring them. Herodotus himself notes this break from the norm as remarkable. The most convincing explanation is also the simplest: rage. 3 days, thousands of casualties, an immortal guard bloodied by farmers and shepherds turned soldiers. Sometimes an empire's most rational man does the least rational thing in his reign, purely because his pride has just taken a wound deeper than any sword could cut. For the ordinary soldiers doing the actual collecting, none of this royal drama changed the job. Valuables still had to be gathered and divided by rank. Officers first, then the men who had distinguished themselves, then everyone else by seniority. A grim kind of fairness, the only kind a battlefield could offer. But the bronze and daggers were, in the end, a minor footnote. The real work, the work that would occupy the army for the better part of the next 3 days, had nothing to do with treasure. It was about what to do with 9,000 bodies before the smell did the job for them.
There is much to be done. Work faster, the heat is unbearable. Get these bodies cleared immediately. Move them to the burial ground now. We must leave this place.
Part 4. A monument made of enemies. Once the dead had been stripped, a second task began, one with no practical purpose beyond memory and fear. The Persians, and later the Greeks who would walk this same path, both understood that a victory no one remembers might as well not have happened. The Greek custom, and Thermopylae itself produced a strange exception to it, was to gather the finest captured arms of the defeated enemy and raise a tropeion, a trophy, a standing monument built around a wooden post, dressed in the captured shield, helmet, and spear of the beaten foe, like a scarecrow built from a dead man's wardrobe. Planted on the spot where the enemy had broken and fled, the word comes from trope, the turning point, the moment the battle's tide shifted. It was built to mark the exact location where courage had failed. Here is the cruel irony of Thermopylae. There was no Greek tropeion raised in 480 BC, because the Greeks did not win it. It was the Persians who held the field, and Xerxes did not need a wooden post dressed in captured shields to prove his victory. He had something far more chilling in mind. The story does not end at Thermopylae, though. A year later, on the plain of Plataea, the Greeks would finally break the Persian land army for good, and there, the tropeion would be honored in full, with Spartan and Athenian hands raising captured Persian wicker shields and curved swords on a standing post for every farmer in Boeotia to see for a generation afterward. The defeat at Thermopylae and the trophy at Plataea became two halves of the same story the Greeks would tell themselves for centuries. The past had been lost, but never in vain. Part 5. What the king left behind. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes, having viewed the Greek dead with his own eyes, gave an order that would echo through antiquity. He commanded that the head of Leonidas be severed and mounted on a stake, displayed for every soldier and traveler on the road south to see. This was not how Persian kings typically treated fallen enemies of noble rank. Cyrus the Great, founder of the empire Xerxes now commanded, had been famous for the opposite instinct, honoring defeated kings, respecting courage in an enemy, rather than desecrating it. Herodotus himself records the act with pointed disapproval, noting it ran against the grain of Persian custom. The most plausible explanation has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with wounded pride. For 2 full days, a king commanding perhaps 200,000 men, Herodotus's own estimate runs into the millions, though modern historians believe the true figure was far smaller, still staggering for its time, had been held at a standstill by a few thousand men in a gap barely wide enough for 10 soldiers abreast. His immortals had been thrown back, bloodied, by Spartan and Thespian spears. For an empire that prided itself on invincibility, the arithmetic of Thermopylae was a humiliation no victory could fully erase. Leonidas's head on a stake was not strategy. It was the bruised ego of the most powerful man alive. The other fallen Greeks received no such individual attention. What happened to them is genuinely disputed. Some accounts suggest they were left exposed on the hillock, denied even the basic burial both cultures generally extended to enemies. In a world where proper rites mattered enormously to the soul's fate, that too would have read as a deliberate insult. What we know with more confidence is what happened once the Persian army marched on. The local Greeks, likely aided in time by the Spartans themselves, gathered the fallen and buried them on that same hillock, the spot that would later carry the famous epitaph attributed to Simonides, that the dead lie here, having obeyed the orders they were given to remain and not retreat. A lion monument was eventually raised there, said to honor Leonidas, whose name carries an echo of the word for lion. The pass remembered its dead, even if the king who won it tried to erase the man who had led them. For the thousands of Persian dead, the question was far simpler. There would be no individual graves, no epitaphs, no lions. Only an enormous logistical problem and an army that needed to keep moving. Part 6. The problem of 9,000 bodies. Strip away the politics of severed heads and broken trophies, and what remained at Thermopylae was, in the most literal sense, an enormous quantity of decomposing flesh under a Mediterranean summer sun, and an army that could not abandon the pass without dealing with it. Ancient warfare had no formal corps of gravediggers. The labor fell on ordinary soldiers, men who had fought for 3 days, now handed shovels and told the campaign south could not continue until the pass was passable again. A mountain road choked with thousands of rotting bodies was a genuine military obstacle, blocking the supply wagons and the baggage train an army this size depended on absolutely. The scale defies easy imagination. 9,000 bodies, by conservative estimates, packed into a battlefield only a few hundred meters across. In the August heat, decomposition does not wait politely for soldiers to finish their other duties. Within a day, the smell alone would have been suffocating. Within 2, crows, vultures, and scavenging dogs would have descended in numbers thick enough that soldiers had to drive them off simply to do their work. For the Persian dead, there was no possibility of returning each man home. The practical answer was the trench grave, long pits dug near the battlefield, bodies laid in by the dozens, then covered as quickly as the soil allowed. Some sources suggest certain officers of high rank may have received more individual treatment, perhaps transport back toward Persian territory for proper rites under Zoroastrian custom. If this happened at Thermopylae, it applied to only the smallest handful. The rest went into the ground in anonymous numbers, the same way they had marched into the pass, as a mass, not as individuals. Archaeological surveys of the region in later centuries would turn up exactly this kind of evidence. Not individual markers, but disturbed ground in patterns too large and too uniform to be anything but mass graves. The silent bureaucratic footprint of an army that had no time for ceremony. The labor itself tested a different kind of endurance than the battle had. There is no glory in this part of the story, no poetry. which is likely why the ancient sources mention it so briefly. Herodotus devotes entire passages to the speeches before the battle, then disposes of the aftermath in a handful of lines. The dead were dealt with. The army moved on. That brevity reflects how routine this horror had become to the people who lived through it. By the time the Persian army broke camp and continued south, the pass had been transformed twice over in 3 days. First into the site of one of the ancient world's most famous massacres, then quietly back into something resembling a road again, passable at last for the soldiers, still marching toward a war nowhere close to finish. Tent. Not every wound at Thermopylae ended in a mercy stroke or an open grave. Some men survived. Persians, mostly, since the Greek defenders had largely fought to the last man. And for them, the days following the battle meant the slow, uncertain business of ancient medicine. The Persian army traveled with physicians, a fact that surprises people who picture this campaign as nothing but spear and fire. Greek medical knowledge had already begun to develop the foundations that would later produce Hippocrates within the same century. Persian medicine drew on its own sophisticated tradition, blending battlefield experience with the religious framework of Zoroastrianism, in which healing carried real spiritual weight. A wound was not merely torn flesh, it was a corruption to be driven out, treated with the seriousness a priest might bring to a ritual. The instruments would look almost unsettlingly familiar today. Bronze probes for examining the depth of a wound, small blades for cleaning torn flesh before it could fester, hooked instruments for extracting an arrowhead too deep for fingers to reach. The greatest danger was never the wound itself, but what followed. Infection, treated as best they could with wine, used both to clean a wound and dull the pain of cleaning it. Vinegar, prized for properties no one in 480 BC could explain, but trusted by experience. And honey, packed directly into open wounds, valued for reasons that would not be understood for another 2,000 years, but worked often enough to become standard practice. For a wound to the limb, the odds of survival were genuinely reasonable, provided infection did not set in. For a wound to the abdomen, the odds collapsed almost to nothing, which is precisely why so many such wounds never reached the physician's tent at all. They were dealt with on the battlefield by the mercy stroke, because everyone understood the alternative was days of agony, ending in the same place regardless. Those who did make it to treatment faced surgery on a fully conscious patient, held down by 2 or 3 strong orderlies while a physician worked, with no painkiller beyond wine, or, for fortunate officers, poppy extract. This was the ceiling of what ancient medicine could offer. For the men in those tents, it was the difference between walking home and not walking at all. Recovery itself could take months, and for an empire as vast as Persia, the calculation of who was worth saving extended beyond the battlefield. A skilled veteran soldier represented years of training that a fresh recruit simply could not replace, which is precisely why physicians traveled with the army at all, rather than being left behind in the capital. Treating the wounded was not generosity. It was an investment the empire intended to recover on some future campaign. The physicians treating wounded Persians would have had little time or inclination to extend the same care to any wounded Greeks who somehow survived the final hours. A defeated enemy who lived past the mercy stroke was no longer, in the practical sense, a patient. He was about to become something else entirely. Part 8. What happens to a captured man? History remembers Thermopylae as a battle fought to the last man. And for the core of the Spartan and Thespian defenders, this is essentially true. But what happened to the men who did not die tells its own uncomfortable story about how the ancient world treated defeat. Herodotus records that the contingent from Thebes, present among the broader Greek force, surrendered to the Persians once the position became hopeless. Whether this reflects genuine cowardice, as later Greek tradition unkindly insisted, or simple pragmatism, the ancient sources disagree. What happened to them afterward is recorded with chilling brevity, branded, by order of Xerxes, with the royal mark used on slaves, and absorbed into the vast captive population that followed every Persian campaign like a shadow. This was the fate awaiting any man taken alive on an ancient battlefield, regardless of side. Capture did not mean rescue. It meant a total transformation from soldier to property, kept, sold, traded, or put to whatever labor a new owner required. For the Persian Empire, hungry for labor to build its roads, palaces, and canals across territory from the Aegean to the Indus, captives represented genuine economic value. A strong man might be sent to hard labor on a building project. A man with a trade, a smith, a carpenter, might find his skills valued enough to spare him the worst of it. The brand itself tells you something the swords cannot. To mark a man's skin permanently as property erased, in the most literal sense, the person he had been that morning. A soldier who had marched under his own city's banner became an entry in someone else's ledger, identified by a mark burned into his arm rather than by who he was. The scale at which the Persian Empire operated this system, feeding it constantly from campaign after campaign, made it something closer to industrial than the smaller slave-taking practiced between individual Greek city-states. For the men of Thebes, who walked out of Thermopylae alive, survival came at a price many of their countrymen would judge far more harshly than the deaths of the men who had stayed. There were, in the brutal moral arithmetic of the ancient world, worse things than dying in the pass. Part 9. The weight Leonidas left behind. Word of what happened at Thermopylae did not travel south as a single piece of news. It traveled in fragments, carried by exhausted messengers and by the few hundred Greek soldiers who had been sent away from the pass before the final stand began, under orders from Leonidas himself. This detail matters enormously, and it is one of the most psychologically brutal aspects of the battle that the popular story tends to flatten into pure heroism. As the scale of the Persian flanking maneuver became clear, Leonidas sent the bulk of the allied Greek army away, preserving them for the wars still to come, and kept only his 300 Spartans, the Thespians who refused to leave, and the Thebans, to hold the pass as long as humanly possible. This means that for every Spartan family back in Lacedaemon, the news arrived carried by men who had stood beside their husbands and sons just days earlier, who had watched Leonidas send them home and keep the doomed behind. Not simply that your son is dead, but that you know the exact moment he was given the chance to leave and chose to stay. Spartan culture had spent generations building a moral framework that made this kind of death the highest honor a man could achieve. Mothers were said to tell departing sons to come back with their shield, or on it, victorious or dead, never having thrown the shield away in flight. A Spartan who survived a battle his commander ordered him to die in was marked for life by a shame worse than death itself. There is a story of a Spartan named Aristodemus, sent away from Thermopylae due to an eye affliction. He survived by accident of illness, returned home alive, and was treated with such open contempt, denied a place in the ranks, refused by name in conversation, that he died the following year at Plataea in a deliberate, almost suicidal display of courage, apparently desperate to erase the shame of having lived. Glory and grief were not separate emotions in this culture. They were fused into a single experience, where mourning a dead son and celebrating his honor happened in the same breath. Stoicism was not simply admired, it was enforced by a society built around the idea that a Spartan does not visibly break, regardless of what breaks inside him. For the wider Greek world, the effect was different, but no less significant. A battle that ended in total defeat became almost immediately the proof that other city-states needed badly, that this enemy could be made to bleed, that the war was not already lost. Leonidas and his 300 had become more useful to the war effort, dead than most living men could ever be. Part 10. The Road to Salamis. By the third day, the pass had been transformed for the second time. What had briefly been one of the bloodiest sights in the ancient Mediterranean world was, once again, simply a road, scarred, marked by fresh graves, but passable. For Xerxes, the victory opened the path south he had wanted all along. The Persian army resumed its march toward Athens, now carrying the added weight of having broken through a position the Greeks had hoped might hold far longer. Athens itself, in the days that followed, made the agonizing decision to evacuate rather than defend the city directly. A decision shaped entirely by the lesson Thermopylae had just taught. A Persian army this size, given enough time and enough bodies to spend, could break through almost any fixed position eventually. But Thermopylae had bought something that mattered more than the pass itself. It bought days that let the Greek city-states finish preparing the fleet that would meet the Persian navy near the island of Salamis only weeks later. And it bought proof, fresh and undeniable, that Persian soldiers could be killed in numbers disproportionate to their losses, by Greeks willing to stand rather than scatter. The 300 had not stopped Xerxes, but they had taught an entire alliance of frightened city-states exactly how to start trying. Soldiers who had watched the immortals bleed against a few thousand Greeks in a narrow pass carried that memory toward Salamis, and eventually toward Plataea the following year, where the debt of Thermopylae would finally be repaid in full, with a tropaion raised at last over Persian dead, on Greek soil, by the country that had buried its 300 without one. We are used to ending this story with a shield, a sunset, and 300 men standing together against an empire. That image earned its place in history for good reason. But the past did not become quiet the moment the cameras, if there had been any, would have stopped rolling. For 72 hours after the last Spartan fell, Thermopylae was not a monument. It was an enormous, grinding labor of sorting the living from the dead, the salvageable from the doomed, the valuable from the worthless. It was Persian soldiers checking corpses with spears instead of hands, afraid that a dead Greek might still have one final act of violence left in him. It was a king so wounded in his pride that he broke his own empire's customs to disfigure the body of a man who had already cost him everything he could take. It was thousands of nameless graves dug in haste, honey packed into open wounds, and a captured man branded like livestock for the simple crime of surviving when his commander had ordered him to die. None of this makes the 300 any less remarkable. If anything, it makes them more so, because real courage was never about a clean death lit by a beautiful sunset. It was about men who understood, with total clarity, exactly what brutal, undignified, unglamorous work would follow their deaths, and chose to stand anyway. That is the Thermopylae the history books rarely have room for. Now you know it too. If this kind of unfiltered look into the ancient world is something you want more of, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which detail from today's episode surprised you the most. There is far more buried in the silence after history's most famous battles than most people ever get to see. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel to discover more fascinating historical stories. See you in the next video.